Hello, welcome to another session of DPOD. In today's session, we'll review DPOD's API Connect functionality. To switch to the API Connect view, use the button on the top right. The API Connect user interface layout is very similar to the IBM Data Power Gateway layout. We will show the user interface as if it is used by a system administrator. Most users will not have access to the Manage and Report sections. The system's security roles are implemented exactly like in the IBM Data Power Gateway view. Let's focus on the Investigate and Dashboard sections. These two sections contain the most commonly used functions. Similar to the IBM Data Power Gateway view, the main API Connect page is the transaction page. We published another video session that focuses solely on the transaction page, where you can find detailed information about the page's layout and features. We recommend that you check it out. The API Connect Transactions page contains more filters than the transaction page for IDG. Most of the filters in this page are unique to API Connect transactions, such as catalog name, space name, plan ID, API name, API version, etc. Let's have a look at the status filter. The status filter will screen successful or erroneous transactions. A transaction is considered as erroneous if it entered the error rule. Once we change the filter value, the grid on the lower part of the screen will be automatically updated with the filtered transactions. In addition to the filters, the page introduces the same features as the IDG screen. The Favorite Filters tool, which allows you to save your favorite and frequently used filters. The Share tool, which allows us to share a screen via link or email. And the Export to CSV button, which will download the transaction list as a CSV file. You can open the file in any spreadsheet program and view the transaction list. Click the transaction ID in order to drill down and view the details of a single transaction. Let's review the screen's layout. The top part outlines general details about the transaction. For example, the device name, the API name, and the query parameters. The middle part of the screen shows whether an error occurred, its analysis, the error message, and response code. Let's examine a transaction that completed successfully. For successfully completed transactions, DPOD will show a bit more information. Here we can see the details of the front-end and back-end latencies, and we can also see the memory consumption during the lifespan of the transaction. The policy flow shows the latency of each policy that ran during the API call. Green nodes are policies that were defined in our assembly, whereas blue nodes are API Connect system policies. Note that DPOD only shows the policies that were actually executed. Let's have a look at the API Connect assembly itself. The assembly contains three policies: an if statement, and an optional JSON to XML policy. Going back to DPOD, we see that we have a node for the if statement, but because the condition was not satisfied, the JSON to XML policy was not executed. And so this isn't shown in DPOD transaction analysis screen. Also note the apim.security policy, which appears here. This policy does not appear in the assembly, since API Connect added it automatically when we chose to use OAuth. The bottom of the screen contains the same four tabs as in the IDG transaction screens. The first one is the Raw Messages tab, showing the API Connect raw messages. The second is the Payload tab. If a WSM subscription was active during the API call, we will see its contents here. In this case, because the HTTP method was GET, we do not have a request payload, but we can see the backend and frontend responses. The system administrator may block all or certain users from viewing raw messages and message payload according to security rules. Next is the Extended Latency tab, showing the internal IDG implementation's latency. For most cases, you should use the policy graph that we showed earlier, which outlines the latency for each policy. The last tab displays any side calls that were part of the API Connect policies, if any such calls were made. If you wish to capture payloads, perform the following steps. Click the Payload Capture tab, and then click the Create Subscription button. Choose the device and the main, and click Create. The payload will be recorded for new API Connect transactions. The system administrator may block all or certain users from recording or viewing payloads. Let's move on to the API Connect dashboards. The recent activity dashboard is very similar to the IDG activity dashboard. On the top, we can see the latency for the top 90th percentile of API Connect calls. The system administrator can change percentile using DPOD system parameters. The number on the top shows the maximum latency of the top percentile for the selected time range. Next, we can see the number of API calls that completed successfully and the number of errorless calls. Below, the system activity graph. It shows you the TPS, transaction per second, and number of errors per second during the selected time range. This graph also shows the number of API calls made in the previous week, for comparison. Since this is a demo environment, the sample you see here does not have any API calls that were made last week. The bottom part of the screen shows 4 grids with more detailed information. The left grid shows the API names with the highest latency for the 90th percentile. As with all DPOD widgets, you can choose how many rows to show, 3, 5, 20, etc. The next grid lists the plan names with most successful API calls. The third grid lists the API names with most successful calls. And the last grid shows the API names with the most errors. Let's have a look at the next dashboard, API Availability. This dashboard shows, according to the selected filters, the last time when each API was called. For example, the Account API was last executed at 1842 on February the 18th. As usual, we can filter the results according to time, device name, API name, etc. To review the next screen, let's go back to IDG View by pressing the button at the top right corner. We'll switch to Analytics and then to Service URI Calls. This screen displays all the calls made to DataPower across all gateways, grouped by the called URI. In order to focus on API Connect services, we can select the domains on which API Connect services are running, or we can select the multi-protocol gateway name of API Connect, such as Web API. The results are sorted by the number of calls in ascending order. You can see maximum, minimum, and average call times, as well as performance percentiles. The system administrator can change these percentile values by configuring DPOD system parameters. A similar screen is the Service URL Calls screen. This screen presents the same information as the last one, but groups the calls by their complete URL address, which includes the full gateway address as well as the query parameters. This screen enables us to compare the response times of a single service, which ran on different gateways or with different query parameters. In our example, the last 2 lines represent the same service. We can see that calling with customer ID 777 and ends with 7 is a little lower than with customer ID 777 that ends with 8. The last feature we'll show is called Auto Setup, and it's designed only for system administrators. From the Manage section, drill down to the device where the API Connect transactions are running, and click the Setup tab. Let's focus on this area of the screen. The Auto Setup feature allows the administrator to set up a domain pattern, for example, API GMT *, and select one of DPOD's syslog agents. Whenever DPOD detects a new domain on a device which matches the pattern, DPOD will automatically set up the domain to report and send syslogs to DPOD. This feature is especially useful when the API Connect management server creates a new domain on our data-powered devices. When auto setup is configured, the system admin does not need to worry about manually setting up every new domain in DPOD. Thank you. We'll be happy to see you in our next session.